coming back with the executions of the work. During the executions of the work, variations may sometimes involve. This one should be under the instructions of the architect and should not vitiate the contract. These variations occurs when there are certain things which was initially not in the contract. This could be due to the modifications of the design, quantity and quality of the works, which has been instructed by the architect to the contractor to carry out. This shall lead to the changes in terms of the payment later. When we talk about the variations, there are two types. One is claimable under the provisional sum. Another one is claimable not under the provisional sum. These are provided that the variations is claimable. If the variations is not claimable, that means the contractors have no justifications to claim for the work additional to the existing scope, as it was not instructed by the architect. Now let us look at the variations which is claimable under the provisional sum. First, what is the provisional sum? This is a sum which has already been calculated in the work, knowing the possibility of its existence within the scope, just that the relevant scope is not clearly specified. As the scope is not clearly specified, or due to lacking of the details, the quantities and the cost related to that particular work cannot be properly quantified. The relevant work can be said that not officials during the stage of the tendering, the employer haven't decided whether the works will be incorporated or not in the actual work later. Knowing the existence of this kind of work, normally the contractor will have to estimate a sum based on their previous experience to be incorporated in lump sum for that particular work. Simply said, the relevant cost has already been estimated within the lump sum of the contract. So if that particular work has already been known or made known to the contractor, which are not being detailed out within the contract, should the work are being instructed, the contractor will be entitled for the claim for the variations, and the relevant expenses will come from this provisional sum. In our previous videos, we have established the rules of valuations for the variations. These rules have been made objective and transparent to the contractors and the employer, and this should be executed accordingly in order to prevent disputes between the contractors and the employer regarding the works related to the variations. Now, before the variations is claimable under the provisional sum, we will need to confirm two things. First is to determine whether it is a valid variations. This can be done by observing the content in the contract, whether there are additional scopes of work or any changes in terms of the design where the relevant cost has not been estimated or proposed by the contractors to the employers. If all the works are similar to the contract, that means there are no additional works, nor there are any changes in terms of the design, that means there is no variations. The contractor will need to carry out the work in accordance to the contract and get paid in accordance to the contract. There won't be additional payments from the employer to the contractor, as it is not the variations at the first place. Let's say now it is confirmed that there are additional works. or changes in terms of the scopes or the amounts of the work different from what has been stated in the contract, that means this is a variations. At this moment, the contractor is entitled to claim for the work done. Now we will need to decide whether it is claimable under the provisional sum or under the provisional quantities. The provisional quantity is normally related to certain words as already known, but its quantity cannot be accurately determined during the formations of the contract. The payment should be on basis of the rates agreed in the contract, multiplied with the total quantity which is actually executed. If the relevant work is of the nature of the provisional quantities, that means there was a rate of payment as agreed between the contractors and the employer. Therefore, the relevant work will be paid on the basis of the rate as agreed between the two parties. Let's say now we know that there is a variations and we have checked it is not under the provisional quantities. That means the variations is claimable under the provisional sum. Technically speaking, the works under the provisional quantity is theoretically not under the variations. As the relevant scopes has already made known, it will be dependent on the final quantities of the work that the contractors is entitled with the payment. It also doesn't mean that when we know it is a variations and it is not under the provisional quantity, it shall automatically be under the provisional sum, as you will need to check whether the provisional sum has already catered for the relevant work. If at the first place the provisional sum has already catered for that work, then it is claimable under the provisional sum. If the relevant work is not being catered under the provisional sum during the formations of the contract, that means it will be a totally additional expenses and it should not be claimed under the provisional sum. That makes the difference between the two types of variations. Now let's say we know it is under the provisional sum. Then this part will apply. And if it is not under the provisional sum, we shall straight away look into this section. Try not to confuse between this and also this. For the variations claimable under the provisional sum, we might need to check the proper scenarios to determine the relevant response in terms of the payments to the contractor. First, we will need to know whether there are items to be omitted from the contract. That means whether it is going to be reductions in terms of the amount of work which was initially agreed between the contractors and the employers. The contractor shall not be paid for the work that not being done by him due to the omissions. Therefore, when there is an omissions, theoretically the amount to be paid will be reduced. Now the question is how the rate is calculated. It will be depending on the work conditions, whether it's going to be substantially varied from the initial work. Some reduction works may change the nature of the work, and the calculations of the rate and price may not be as simple as multiplying the quantities with the rate. Let's say the work conditions are not substantially changed. The reductions can be based on the rates and the price in the contract, multiplied with the amounts of the quantities that has been reduced. However, if the work conditions has been substantially changed, by simply minusing the rate might not be accurate, then the quantifications will be based on the price of the remaining items. The principle behind here is we need to be fair to the contractor as well, ensure that he is not manipulated by the employer to his own advantage. Let's say now there is no omissions. It is either simply change the scope of work or additions to the existing scope of work. Then we will need to look into the characters and conditions of the relevant works. If the characters of the relevant works is similar, that means we can acquire some guide from the contract as a basis for the payments to the contractor. We will take the words which have the similar characters as a guidance, and then we will evaluate the conditions whether it is similar. If the conditions is similar, the valuations will be more straightforward, and we will see the quantities of the words whether it is similar. If the quantities of the words are similar, we can straight away use the rates and the price in the contract. But if the quantities of the words is different, we will use the rates and the price in the contract as the basis, plus some fair adjustment in terms of the rate to cater for the relevant quantities. Let's say now the conditions is different. That means we cannot literally use the rates and price in the contract, as this may incur additional costs to either the contractors or the employer. It depends on the situations. If we use the rate and price in the contract, it might skew towards the advantage of the contractor, or sometimes skew towards the advantage of the employer. We will need to be fair in these conditions. Then the rate and price in the contract should be taken as the reference, and there should be fair adjustment in terms of the rate. Let's say now we cannot find any words which have the similar characters within the contract. That means this is something totally new. The relevant price and rate has not been agreed between the contractors and the employer. There is no precedence as a reference. Then this rule will follow. We will see whether the work can be properly measured or valued. If this can be done, the fair market rates and price will be determined by quantity surveyor, and this rate and price will be multiplied with the quantities done under the variations to determine the cost to be paid to the contractor. Let's say the relevant work cannot be quantified or measured. Then our first options, it will be find some mechanism to quantify it, which is by the numbers of the days of the work. And then the payment will be on basis of the rates of the day works in the contract. But if this cannot be quantified by days of works, a simple rule of thumb will apply, where the actual cost of the contractor will have to plus 15% profit to the contractor. This is about the variations claimable under the provisional sum. You see the entire process here is rather objective, and there shouldn't be any argument between the contractors and the employer. Now let's say that the relevant word has not been put under the provisional sum. That means it is totally new. The contractors is not aware of its existence during the formations of the contract. It was not informed to the contractor, and the relevant cost has not been incorporated within the contract sum. That means it's going to be additional expenses to the employer. With that, this rule shall follow. Now we know that it is a variations and it is not under the provisional quantity, nor it is under the provisional sum. But for these additional words, the contractor will need to be paid and the employer will need to allocate additional sum to finance the work. So what you need to do, you will require the architect instructions, or if the instructions is given verbally by the architect, the contractor can send in the confirmations of architect instructions. This is going to place a records and the evidence that it is a formal instructions given by the architect. So you know it is not under the provisional sum. If it is under the provisional sum, this rule will follow. If it is not, the contractor will need to notify the architect regarding the estimated expenses. Calculations for those expenses will need to be demonstrated to the architect in order to justify the relevant expenses. This will have to be done in a formal manner, written in documents and properly compiled within 28 days of the instructions from the architect. This should have notified to the employer, allowing the employer to prepare for additional funds for the work. After the variation works has been completed, the contractor may submit the claim plus the particulars as well as the calculations within 28 days of completions. Everything needs to be properly proven so that the contractor is entitled for the claim. This is to ensure that the employer are not being exploited or taken advantage by the contractor. Now let us proceed with our previous discussions regarding the major timeline here. We are now still at this stage, done the discussions about the variations. So far we have reached to clause 15 up to these videos. There are additional informations which has not been introduced to you. We shall discuss in details in the later part of the module. We shall focus on the areas that has been discussed until to the previous videos. So in the case there are variations somewhere between the work, the contractor will be entitled for the claim. Assuming everything has been done, the work has been completed, the contractor should notify to the architect to inspect for the practical completions. Architect will do the inspection. If he finds that the work is not practically completed, architect will send notice of incompletions of the work to the contractor. At the same time, that notice will be sent a copy to the nominated subcontractor. In this case, architect do not need to notify the employer. As long as no notifications to the employer, that means the work has not been completed yet. Let's say now the work has practically completed. Architect will see if there are any minor works or defects. If there are no minor works and defects, architect can issue the certificate of practical completions within 14 days of the written notice sent to the architect, and the date of CPC, it will be based on the date of the notice of completions. However, if minor works and defects are found by the architect, then architect should notify the contractor, and the contractor should send in a notice of undertaking the rectification works. That means the contractor must promise that he would rectify the work. before the certificate of practical completion is issued. The date of this CPC, it will be in accordance to the date of the notice of undertaking. Since it involves CPC, that means the works is considered practically completed. It fulfills the functionality of the structures and the employer can engage the structures safely. This should have been notified to the employer. Therefore, this CPC will be sent to the contractor and a copy to employer, another copy to the nominated subcontractor. After acquiring the CPC, Certificate of Practical Completions, the employer may possess the site and the defect liability period triggers. These defect liability periods normally in the range of 12 months. The contractor will have to guarantee there are no noticeable defects. In the case that there are defects, the contractor will need to rectify it at its own cost. If the contractor chooses not to rectify it, the employer may pay another person for the work and the cost will be offset from the payments to the contractor. Or the employer may accept the work as it is, that means the work is with defects, but there will be cost offset from the payments from the contractor. Or can choose to extend the time given to the contractor, insisting the contractor to rectify it. Either of this way will have the cost incurred to the contractor. Coming back to the major timeline here, now that the employer has possessed the site and it is still under the defect liability period, and the employer found no defects of the structure, then everything is okay. The employer is happy and the contractors do not need to do any further works. However, if there are defects, the architect will compile the schedules of defects, and this schedule of defect will list out all the defects that require the contractor to rectify, and this should be sent the latest within 14 days of the expiry of this defect liability period. Having this schedule of defects sent to the contractor, it will be up to the contractor whether decided to make good of those defects. Normally, the contractor should make good of those defects, and it should be done within 28 days from the schedules of defects. Once this is done, the contractor will send a notice to the architect. The architect will do the inspections. If everything cleared, architect will issue a certificate of making good defects within 14 days. However, if the defect has not been made good, architect will need to send a notice to the contractor stating the reason why the certificate of making good defects is not issued, and this notice should also be sent to the nominated subcontractor. Since that the defect has not been made good, it is not necessary to notify to the employer until the defect has been made good. So at the end of the day, if the contractor refuses to make good of those, the cost should be offset from the payments to the contractor, as this is the responsibility of the contractor. This is what is implied in this flowchart here. Now the contractor refused to make good of those defects. The employer can pay the other persons to do the rectification work. The cost will be set off by the contractors, and this is only valid when the relevant defects are found within the defect liability period. not later than 14 days after the expiry of this defect liability period. So, this is an overview of the entire process of the project, which we have already covered up to now in this module. So far, we have covered until clause 15 of the PAM contract 2018. There are more to come. This will unleash more information within the project. There are still quite a number of the flowchart that we haven't discussed in detail yet. We shall come back and revisit this flowchart in the videos in future. What you see here, studying the contracts or the PAM contract may seem to be quite dull and uninteresting. It is challenging indeed due to several reasons. First is due to the complexities of the statements, which they will need to spell out every single possible scenario, make it precisely delivered to the readers in order to avoid confusions and ambiguities, so that it is not being made advantage by any parties who deliberately change the meanings of the relevant statements towards his own advantage. You will need to read between the lines carefully, spend some time to understand the meaning and rationale behind the statement. This is one challenging part. The second challenging part, it will be, you see all the text here. Having all text understood the meaning, but you find difficulty to imagine graphically or to see the entire pictures of the project. There are sequences, there are cause and effects, covering different scenarios. If you manage to have all this properly organized, you will find yourself understanding it easier. Having this to be constructed is not easy. Many hours you will need to invest into it. You will need to first understand, digest fully the meanings of the statement. You will have to read the statement and make comparison, find the linkage between different clauses to find their relationships in terms of the cause and effects. And then you will need to spend time to work out this flowchart. Having this presented to you, it makes your learning process to be easier, and you can always come back and revisit the flowchart for you to quickly grasp the information within the PAM contract. The third challenge about studying this PAM contract and the contract, especially for the students, is lacking of the experience from the industry. There are certain technical terminology which are not often seen in your other course, but is commonly used in the industry. For example, DLP, Defect Liability Period, CPC, Certificate of Practical Completions, Provisional Sum, Provisional Quantities, AI, CAI, and all sorts. In order to overcome this, we will have to go through this module slowly, one by one. Try to understand the meanings of those terminology and try to imagine the relevant conditions in the industry. This will help you to understand better this module. Congratulations to you that you have come so far. If you manage to understand most of the information within the flowchart here, including those presented in the recent videos, you are on the right track. Keep it up and happy learning.